Hello, everyone. This is episode 207, Discerning Who Your Teachers Are. I'm Cherie Burton, and this is a podcast for those who long to feel, express, and be who they truly are. That's kind of where we're going with this episode. It's my dear friend Amber Richardson, whom I nearly co-authored a book with. She's a great researcher, facilitator, amazing feminine spiritual being, and we share a love of all things Mary Magdalene, which is originally how we connected. She's won many awards throughout many mediums of creative work, and she's been teaching about spirituality and healing from patriarchy for 12 years. So her common thread that runs through her creative work is this desire to expand the female experience within a spiritual context. So we very much are aligned in terms of empowering women to make informed and thoughtful choices as they move into their own sovereign path. So today we're going to talk a lot about the mother wound. We're going to acknowledge how messy it can get when you're trying to connect to truly authentic spirituality, not the whitewashed version of it. And because mine and Amber's context is in the lens of Mormonism, that's our religion of origin, that's kind of where we orient when we talk about religious rules of engagement for females and authority figures, of course, with all respect for those of varying belief systems. But in this particular episode, we're going into what does a woman in power look like, particularly spiritual empowerment. And as always, it's much appreciated to have you rate this podcast on iTunes so that more people can find these discussions who are in transition or who are needing more support as they go through the dark night of the soul, or who just need validated for saying yes to where their heart is calling them. Remember to follow me on Instagram, Cherie.Burton, as well as ask to join our private Facebook community, Stand, Speak, Shine community. You can find Amber at Bone Song Retreats on Instagram with underscores between each of those words. And she has upcoming retreats in April. So I hope, again, that you enjoy this episode and connect to both of our work. My dear friend Amber, welcome to Stand, Speak, Shine. When it was Women Seeking Wholeness, you were one of my earlier guests. But how many years ago was that? 3?
I think that was in 2019.
I think it was in 2019.
In 2019.
Yeah. What a journey we have been in together since then.
Seriously.
For those of you needing more context about my connection with Amber, a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and they were like, oh, you two are really going to vibe. And of course we did. We actually did a Mary Magdalene retreat together in Midway, if you recall. That was in 2019. So I know, that was in 2019.
That was just before COVID.
Just before COVID. And then you and I partnered, which we thought was going to be a joint venture in co-authoring a book together. But as it turns out, we each had our own unique sovereign stories to tell. So we traveled to England together, and we had this glorious experience in a farmhouse outside Glastonbury for, what was it, a week and a half? I almost killed both of us. I almost killed both of us driving on the wrong. That was the most heinous driving experience ever. But here we are.
Super scary.
Here we are.
Well, you were the one willing to drive, so I really can't complain.
Oh my goodness. So that was fun. We went to the Roman baths. Like, that was an epic grounding into feminine nurturing with the earth. That's how I look back on that time. Because you and I were also part of a mister school that took us up the tour and all kinds of amazing places. Mary Magdalene Chapel, wearing red, all of that. We both come from the same faith heritage, Mormonism, and we've had quite a journey with that as well. But today we're going to talk about the mother wound. And just so you listeners know, Amber is an avid researcher. She's very versed in a lot of different scriptural texts. We want to tell them actually a little bit about your project that you've been doing with women in the scriptures.
Yeah. So in 2019, I had a Kickstarter funded for a book called Woman Crowned. It's about women in the Old Testament, characters who I argue act as archetypes for the Divine Mother. Usually Kickstarters don't take quite so long to turn around, but I came into the project without much guidance, and I didn't realize that writing a book is not what you should be doing when you're recovering from childhood sexual trauma. They're just not really
not super compatible.
compatible exercises. Yeah. So I've had a lot of writer's block, and I attribute most of it to that conundrum that it's too much to try and do both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I'm still working on it.
Yeah. And I'll have this in the show notes for listeners to go back and listen to our previous episode in 2019, where you did detail that and how Magdalene came to you, and you had this whole amazing experience with really being supported in that healing through your own pathway. I think as you were talking about archetypes, I mean, yes, we have these historical figures, these feminine heroines, if you will, in scripture and sacred text, but sometimes also it's archetypal and metaphorical. And that could be just as powerful, and attaching to these visceral figures that allow us to weave our experience into what they're representing and what they've walked through and conquered or have transcended or ascended, right, with their own set of trials, the heroine's journey, really. And that's what we're all trying to attach to, some semblance of show me how it's done. and that's how I now, that's how I orient myself now with all these really fascinating figures. I think patriarchy would have us go into literalism with all of them, which you can't really posit that everything is literally as we were told or as it was written, because so much has happened with the texts, and so much changing of hands and commentary, that I think it's just so personal for each one of us.
Yeah, I like your point about approaching these characters in these texts looking for guidance. That was really where I wanted to kind of focus my thoughts today. So I've been doing lots of personal work around the mother wound for many years now, and it's a multi-legged animal, that mother wound. And just when I think I've gotten to the bottom of it, it reveals a new facet of itself that I didn't foresee coming. There's a therapist named Kelly McDaniel, who recently published a book called Mother Hunger. My roommate had a copy, and I gobbled it up very quickly. And she breaks the mother wound down into 3 categories. And she's primarily talking about mother hunger as it applies to relationships that are earthbound, so between the daughter and her mother, not so much looking at divine architecture themes. Anyway, her 3 pillars of the mother wound are, and how they're kind of experienced amongst daughters, they revolve around missing nurturance, missing protection, and missing guidance, which I thought is a really nice breakdown and a good way to sort of categorize things. I know missing nurturance often manifests itself as attachment wounding. Missing protection is a really difficult one to summarize quickly, so I'm going to skip that. And we'll talk about missing guidance, referring, at least in my own thought process, to the paths that have not been yet excavated. What does it mean to mature as a woman? How does a mature woman engage with spirituality? What factors are preventing us from maturing? And how do we do all of this on the individual level while still living in a predominantly patriarchal society? Yeah, this factor of missing guidance, I think, is largely responsible for the pacing at which change happens, and also what the process actually looks like. I have a quote here from Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the author of Women Who Run with the Wolves. She says on page 186, if a woman is in exile, if she is an ugly duckling, if she is unmothered, her instincts have not yet been sharpened. She learns instead by trial and error. Usually many trials, many, many errors. But there is hope, for you see, the exile never gives up. She keeps going until she finds the guide, the scent, until she finds the trail, until she finds home.
She finds home. How would you define home? Especially in her context, maybe.
Yeah, I think I would define home dually. Firstly, I would say that to find home inwardly is to come into a place of individuation where you understand who you are and you love who you are, and you've been able to reclaim and accept the totality of you. And I think as that happens, you begin to find relationships in the outer world who can offer you that same kind of sight and loving. And that's what she talks about. This is her chapter on the ugly duckling. So she talks about, it's a story by Hans Christian Andersen, the little swan chick who accidentally gets raised by ducks and is outcast and bullied for looking so gangly and odd. But then once he matures, he discovers that he was actually a swan, and he finds his kind.
I used to love that. I had a storybook about that when I was growing up. And to be honest, I considered myself an ugly duckling. I was between two sisters. One was the homecoming queen and the brilliant artist and super beautiful and skinny and popular. And my younger sister, just 2 years younger, was lead in the school musicals and very overtly musically talented, born with perfect pitch, wrote songs, played several instruments, had a music scholarship. And I was kind of that person in the middle going, I don't know what I would categorize myself necessarily as ugly, but the awkward, like late bloomer sort of analogy of this whole, of how that works, I definitely identified with very, very young.
Yeah, me too. That was a story that I saw myself in as well. And within the context of her work, she uses that story as an analogy for how it may feel as a woman to start coming into your power, to start coming into these parts of yourself that you've been socialized to believe are unacceptable, like wildness.
Yeah, the wild woman archetype.
Yeah. So she compares the wild woman archetype to the ugly duckling. It's really lovely because the story does provide a framework for an ending that I think is optimistic.
Yes, there is hope for those of us who maybe float around on the, I guess I don't want to say margins. It's just not, it's not that. It's more than that. It is when you're talking about coming home to yourself, the ugly duckling, she just hasn't found her home yet, right? She's just not home yet inside of herself, which is, as you mentioned, there's a dual nature to that. It's the home you experience in the physical 3D world, if you will, is a definite, there's a definite marriage between how you've come home to yourself and how that's reflected in your outer world. So I love that. So with this arc of sort of like, trying to come in and maybe identify with this mother wound and how it lives in you through these three pillars, missing the nurturing, the guidance, and the protection. Why don't we, I don't know if you're done exploring the guidance piece of it, because that is the most intriguing to me. So I love that you went there. But when I think about protection, I just want to briefly touch on protection before we move forward with that, because many of the women that I attract into my space are mothers, and they're trying to reconcile or maybe reparent themselves, right? But they're also parenting children. And I definitely put myself in that category. My youngest is 8 right now. And I have older kids, of course, but it's been this I hadn't completely opened up all of my childhood wounds with the first set of kids when I was raising them. But I'm a lot more open, real, and wild woman, I guess, with what's come forward for me with these younger 2 children, because there's 12 years between Sawyer and Eli. And so I find myself going, how did I protect what walls did I build up in protection mode? And how did that affect my parenting, and how did that affect how I treated myself and others? So I just wanted to touch on that with protection. The women that come into my space, whether they felt like they didn't have a mother who was a voice for them or advocated for them or physically protected them like a mother bear would. They also, I have seen the flip side of that, where the mother was overprotective. So that wasn't missing protection. There was an overprotection. And so they didn't ever galvanize their own sense of sovereignty, if you will, or, individuation that you're talking about. So it's interesting to me how you can see these on both sides. Like either there was an overabundance of nurturing, protection, and guidance in an unhealthy way, maybe to shield from the world, or the reverse of what you're talking about, where it's just missing. I think maybe we want to meet in that middle ground. I'm all about the middle path these days, swinging back into the middle and looking at, there's got to be a middle ground here that feels safe.
I'm glad you brought that up. Just sort of processing my thoughts. Yeah, it's interesting because I would say that I was raised by an overprotective mother. But in my case, the instinct that she had towards extreme sports protection, it came out of a place of unresolved trauma, and it was fueled by a lot of anxiety. And the fact of the matter is that that necessitated or meant that she had blind spots. She had some really big blind spots because she wasn't actually confronting what was at the root of the anxiety. And so even though in many ways I was sheltered, there were some things that got through. And they were exactly the things that I believe probably caused the original trauma, not just for her, but several generations back. So it's an interesting thing to contend with, that, and what I guess I'd like to hone in on here is, I'm guessing that most of the women you work with who felt like they were sheltered or were overprotected probably were not protected from patriarchy.
Like the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's important to acknowledge. And that's mostly what Kelly McDaniel looks at in this book when she talks about missing protection. She's talking about mothers who are unable to shield their daughters from the negative influences of patriarchy. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. And it's an interesting thing to sort of unpack and try to unpeel. What does it mean for a mother to take an overprotective stance that's ultimately not successful because she's unable to identify the real threat,
Oh, that's so true. Well, let's dive into the patriarchy piece if you're okay with that.
Sure.
And how it shapes this mother wound. It not only shaped it, but created it.
Right.
The rift, I call the psychic rift we all carry inside of us, is the split from the mother. That's how I've experienced it in my life.
Yeah.
Not my own mother. I'm talking about, we have a heavenly father, God, or God, the father. It's all male, right? But even before the Christian definition of God came forward, there was this patriarchal decimation, really, of all things feminine.
Yeah, I mean, at this stage in my process, I'm starting to think about patriarchy as a consciousness more than a system, although it is obviously both. And simplifying this concept is not easy, but if I were to attempt it, I would say that patriarchy is a system of priorities, beliefs, perspectives, a consciousness that privileges men over women, and that consciousness has entrenched itself in our political systems, our religious systems, our cultures. Unlike some things, patriarchy is multicultural, and it's not primarily an output of people of like Western European origin. It's something that exists almost everywhere and has for a really, really, really long time. And so it cuts us off from the mother, meaning the divine mother, meaning the earth, meaning the mature aspect of our psyches. And it does this in a variety of ways, but primarily because it's been known to be very oppressive and very violent for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so unconsciously, we collude with it to keep ourselves safe, even though the cost of that collusion is basically the fracturing of our souls. And most of this happens unconsciously, which I may have already said. Yeah. So.
Yeah, especially with our mothers and their mothers and their mothers and their mothers. When we talk about the feminine carrying unhealed trauma, as you know, and mentioned, it's patriarchy is not gender specific. It's not men. It's not even really men in power necessarily, as much as it is an ideological consciousness type of, that we've all been feeding. We've all been complicit in that unknowingly, but especially our mothers and their mothers and their mothers. There just wasn't the awareness around. It was just, this is the way it is,
Yeah.
And I know my mom was born, I think it was second wave. No, it wasn't first wave feminism. When was first wave feminism?
First wave feminism is the suffrage movement. So your mom was probably a second.
Yeah, I would say she was second then. Yeah. Not that old. But my mom was like the generation where they were burning their bras, and my mom didn't do that, but the 70s, right? Late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. And it's been interesting. You see, at least with my own mother, and she's very open about this, you see the anger coming out, but it's misdirected. So it's like, yes, I've been silenced, and yes, there's some oppression here, and sometimes there's awareness around it, but usually it's just that anger gets directed to, or misdirected, I should say, right? The sense of powerlessness or not having a voice.
Yeah. And I think anger being misdirected is also a self-preservation technique, definitely an unconscious one. But if you direct that anger at the proper target, that's
a good thing.
That's a big confrontation,
Yeah.
Even if it's just happening in your mind. So maybe it's important to practice accepting the anger and feeling the anger, not shooting it at the right target until you're really ready to deal with those consequences.
Exactly. I was asked by Amy McFit-Olivas to do an episode last year on her podcast, Breaking Down Patriarchy, on sacred rage. And it's the anger piece, right? That's affecting our health. And it's the breaking down of, okay, if I don't express this, things are not going to go well for me. And that's what I came down to for myself. And as you know, my mode of expression is not just this podcast, because I think through writing and getting the context out of how it impacts systems and intergenerational trauma and white colonialism. I mean, there's so much there with that mother wound specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what have you seen I know that you'd mentioned to me earlier, when we're missing the guidance piece, that I'll let you speak to that in terms of mysticism and that being an outgrowth of mysticism.
Yeah. So, I'm sure that this missing guidance piece probably has application to women from lots of different walks of life, women who want to work in the corporate world, women in academia, although I think many of those paths have already been a little bit more opened up. For me, I do a lot of exploration in the world of mysticism and spirituality, and figuring out what that looks like as a woman, kind of coming out of a very patriarchal framework of Mormonism. It's been, as Clarissa Pinkola Estes said, a process inundated with trial and error. It's been the story of the ugly duckling. The duckling gets rejected by its adopted siblings. It gets rejected by its mother. It gets bullied. It leaves the pond that it was hatched on. It gets bullied by a cat and a hen, and it falls into the ice, and a farmer takes it home, and it's awkward and gangly, and it knocks over a bin of flour, and it stumbles out into the cold night, and spring finally comes, and that's the moment when the duck discovers it was a swan, right? And I see in the world of spirituality a lot of hesitance to acknowledge the humanness of these processes,
the messy, chaotic.
Yeah. And also just like the day-to-day, like the human error, the stuff that's like embarrassing or awkward. It isn't cosmic or earth-shattering. And and it seems like trial and error, at least for me, is the only way that it can be, because I cannot seem to find real guides. All I've got are books written by people that I'll probably never meet because they're already dead or about to die. And so trying to figure out how to implement this, it's a process. It's difficult, and I wanted to speak to that.
I love that you're mentioning that. I do not follow any quote unquote influencers, guides, mentors, especially not gurus anymore, unless they are in the real, capital T, capital R. It doesn't interest me how polished they look and what they've accomplished or what course they're giving or what have you. I want to know how they've gone through the dark night, how they've navigated it, how they've been initiated, so to speak. I call it the sacred feminine initiation, whether you're male or female. It's just coming to terms with, okay, it's kind of like identity death and the reformation of your new self, whatever that might be, which is always a work in progress. But I'm with you. I see a lot of spiritual bypassing. And I think that it's becoming, I think people are a little bit more attuned to it now. They're a little bit more savvy in terms of when they're seeing it happen. But for some, it can be so subtle. It's like, if I don't show up a certain way, if I don't look put together, and you and I were raised in this culture of toxic perfectionism, so we totally see it clearly, but sometimes it's a little bit more subtle.
Yeah, it's very subtle. And I think that might be one of the skill sets that isn't really talked about oftentimes. So like, if you're a run-of-the-mill Instagram spiritual teacher and you've taken on the mantle and you haven't done a lot of personal work, there are reasons why you're not going to talk about the human aspects of the process. You might not be conscious that that's what you're doing,
right.
But you're trying to draw people into your offerings. You're trying to maybe save the world, make a big change, and you don't want to slow that process down and embarrass yourself and kind of lead with your shame and the things that you're embarrassed about.
Yeah, like you're saying, it's that self-preservation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so people, they don't often offer like the tools that can then be used to potentially like criticize the self, if that makes sense. Like, why would you offer your potential like students or clients information that they might use to choose not to work with you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To wake up to like look at things in clear seeing, and
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I'd like to do a little bit of that here, and I'd like to start with this idea, and that is, if you're coming out of, whether or not you're officially resigning, that's not really a question in my mind. If you're coming out of an old paradigm that's really patriarchal and you're jumping into this new spiritual world, it would really behoove you to, as you're making that transition, focus on sharpening your skills of discernment, which means that you're going to have to start looking at some things that are inside of you too. You can't just look at things on the outside without contending with them inside. If you do that, then you're going to have things that are unconsciously driving your ship, and you're just going to keep looping into relationships, even with like teachers and peers that are going to reflect back at you the things that you haven't contended with yet.
Yeah, the internalized patriarchy that we've internalized. It doesn't matter if you exit a system, a religion, a group, whatever, and excise yourself from that. If you haven't dealt with that, like you're saying, the internalized patriarchy, you're going to go find and attach to another dynamic that's very similar to the one you just walked out of.
Yeah. So a good way to talk about this, and the way that I know best, is by reflecting on the way Mormonism deals with power dynamics, the way that Mormonism deals with teaching, these kinds of things. So Mormonism has very, very strict codes around who in the room has the authority, how that authority should be meted out, and what's appropriate for, like basically what the rules of engagement are for people in relationship to power. And I think of Mormonism kind of in a similar way that I think of America. And I believe that's an appropriate comparison to make. Yeah. I think Mormonism is to America what Catholicism is to Old World Europe. Mm-hmm. Right. So the onus of America is essentially that you have a group of people who are living on the other side of the Atlantic, and they're tired of being under the thumb of the ruling class elite. And under the thumb maybe isn't the best way to describe what was happening there. It was very real oppression going on for centuries, and these people were done. And so they got on ships and they sailed across the ocean to the new world that was in fact not new, that was in fact already inhabited by thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah. Indigenous, yes. Mm-hmm. It's the classic indigenous, yeah.
Yeah. So they arrive and they've got a little bit of an axe to grind, and they want to establish a new way of being in the world, and they want to create something that's going to prevent what happened before from reemerging and recreating itself. And this is the bedrock upon which democracy is built, or was built. And I think democracy is pretty fabulous as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's done a lot of really good things, but it also has a shadow side, a certain paranoia, if you will, around who has the power and what it means to have the power. And of course, what's interesting about if you're like me, I've got progenitors who, came over on Mayflower. So I'll say are to be inclusive if there are others out there who have long-time American inheritance. But what's interesting is many of them came here and enacted upon the land and the indigenous people exactly what had been perpetrated on them by the ruling class elite. Yeah. So, there were shadows that weren't being fully confronted or looked at, and that's how these things get perpetuated. All of that.
Oh, sorry, just to interject.
Oh, please.
Just even where I live in Utah, this is the place where Brigham Young, quote unquote, came over and said, this is the place, but there were already indigenous people here. And it was sort of that manifest destiny, settling, God has willed this, and we can pretty much perpetuate anything we want in the name of God. And Amber, right. I've deconstructed things to the point where I think it all boils down to white colonialism or white colonization, white male colonization, to be more specific.
Yeah, there's so much that we talked about there. I guess the comparison that I'm trying to draw is, I think those same dynamics and shadows exist within Mormonism. So Mormonism, the axe that is originally being ground there is similar. It's like, okay, this is how Catholicism organizes itself. This is how Catholicism uses power. And so we're going to build in basically checks and balances into our organizational political structure in order to prevent that from happening again. And it does have that effect, because people have to be called to positions. You can't really, even like on a local level, you can't really, you can't garner power. You can't petition for positions. And if you do, that's usually frowned upon. And is a signal to others that you probably shouldn't be given that calling because you asked for it.
Yeah.
Right. And it trickles down even into just the cultural understanding we have around something like a Sunday school teacher. There's a popular maxim in Mormonism that anybody can teach. Doesn't matter how long you've been a member, doesn't matter how long you've been active, anybody can teach. And, we want everybody to have a voice. But in a religious culture where there is no, how would you say it? We don't have spaces for mature spirituality. We don't have
which involves inquiry and questions and not entertaining doubts, but rigorous conversations that are deep and on shady gray areas that are nonlinear.
Exactly. And also like working with components of the human experience that we don't want to expose small children to because they don't have the ballast and the internal tools developed yet to be able to deal with those in a way that's going to be healthy, right?
Right.
So in a system where we don't have spaces for mature spiritual growth and exploration, this maxim works that anybody can teach. But when you start getting into the deep tissues and spiritual, like when you get into trauma and how spirituality mixes with trauma, this maxim that anyone can teach is absolutely not true. There are certain skill sets that need to be developed. There are certain, you get to a point where you need to have a certain amount of vision, where you can't guide people past where you yourself have gone. And
also, there's a curriculum in front of you that it's really hard to venture outside of that without the rest of the class pulling you back down into like what's approved. Yeah. That was my problem. I was always the person raising her hand, in Sunday school, trying to bring it back to mercy, compassion, love, and forgiveness. And that's just not where the class really wanted to be. It's not where, I shouldn't say that. There was a hunger from the class for it to go there, but everyone knew that wasn't the approved doctrine in most instances.
Right. So often because the collective and whatever setting you're in, and it can change from ward to ward. But if the majority of people in the room are not wanting to develop themselves in certain ways, then you're beholden to where the group is, which I think is why so many of us end up journeying out into the wilderness. We kind of have to go one by one alone because we're just not being fed. And that's another reality that's not really recognized in those systems. There is a certain level of nourishment that is required if you want to develop yourself beyond where you've seen your mothers develop themselves. And service will not get you there solely. You have to be receiving nourishment as well. And if you're not getting it there, then sometimes you kind of have to go out into the wilderness. But I know that you recently released a podcast episode about your journey into your wilderness. And I would guess that many women who listen resonated with that. And so what I'd like to do in the time remaining is just sort of talk about a few things that I've learned through my processes of trial and error in my own wilderness. And, in the hopes that these ideas might be helpful to people who are exploring spirituality outside of these frameworks that we grew up with.
Love it. Yeah. And as I look back really on my journey, I mean, I say, well, my crisis of faith or my faith crash or I actually call it a church crisis, not a faith crisis, but it in fact imploded in early 2019, late 2018. And as I reflect back, like this was a process of many, many years before that where something wouldn't resonate. And I was somehow able to give myself permission to venture into a different pathway of like the divine feminine, for example, or studying the life of Mary Magdalene and going into the Gnostic texts, which are not approved, quote unquote, right? And that led to almost a different way of looking at spiritual gifts. And I love that you brought up mysticism as well, because a mystic is simply, to me, someone who longs for union with the divine. And it's actually a sort of a gnosis. It's more of a like experiential spirituality where it's felt in the body and sensed. And it's very much, I think, what religion is trying to point people to, but they're also simultaneously afraid of it. And especially with women, right? Because of the hierarchy. But yes, I would love to explore what you're talking about, because my sense is there are many women, it doesn't matter if they even grew up religious, there's still a stigma attached to how do you carve your own spiritual path and individuate? Because I know the word sovereign is very powerful to you and I.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very sacred word to me. It's not, I'm still defining it for myself.
Yeah. Thank you for kind of sharing that and offering that additional context. I really appreciate it. Okay, so in the world of Mormonism, and maybe this will be true for other listeners who come out of Christian traditions, there are so many rules and structures in place for how it's appropriate to navigate power. And of course, if you're a woman in a system like that, it's not appropriate really to do anything at all. It's not even really appropriate to long after power, to long after feeling power.
Right.
And there are all kinds of rules about what God will do. I mean, we pay homage or lip service rather to the idea that like God has his own will, his own time, God's ways are higher than ours. But when it comes down to brass tacks, we have very specific rules about what God will do, what God can do. And primarily, like, I see a lot of denial around like God wrecking us, God breaking us open, God, destroying our egos, like this kind of thing. Like, we don't really want a God who's going to do that. We don't really want a God who's going to invert our complete understandings of what life is. We prefer our God not to have close association with chaos. And for me, when I stepped out of that box and tried to continue communing and finding spirituality, it was a confrontation with huge chaos, right? Suddenly I found myself in circles of women who were talking about dragons, aliens, reincarnation. I had a man, a lovely man. He was convinced that I was a reincarnated Greek priestess. And I just could not even, my paradigm could not even approach what that was. I just was like, what on earth? So much craziness, and yet I would have these profound experiences where I would feel the spirit, not in that particular moment and not in a lot of the moments that I've just made quick reference to. I remember I had this one particular experience with a woman, a facilitator. On her website, she said, "Don't put me on a pedestal or I'll dance my way off of it." And I remember reading that and thinking, I don't know if that's fully cooked. And then I was with her and we had a shared love of Mary Magdalene. And I was talking about a text in the Old Testament, the Song of Solomon, that many believe is Magdalenic symbolically. Mm-hmm. She'd never heard about it before. She wasn't raised Christian. And the next day, she came back to the group and she announced to the group that God had revealed to her something in the Bible. And she proceeded to read directly from the Song of Solomon. I think I had been telling her about the symbology of the rose and that in the Jewish tradition, it likely dates back to the Song of Solomon. Right. So she came into the room, revealed that God had revealed this to her.
Well, Amber, I guess you're God then.
Yeah. And read it for the group, and everybody was starry-eyed and just totally willing to go there with her. And I remember thinking, oh, this is so strange. Like, I feel really weird about that. Not 3 days later, the same woman intuitively produced a personal ceremony for me that was one of the most profound experiences I've ever had, feeling God's love ever in my life. And I walked away from that whole thing utterly befuddled. Like, how could all of those things have just happened in the same 3-day period? And the truth is, I still don't have the answer because none of my frameworks in the past work. They don't really cover what's going on. And
I
so,
think it's the intention of the receiver. This is just where I'm at with it, because I see a lot of very well-meaning but egotistical leaders seeking to really help humanity, and in the same breath, showing up very imperfectly, or if not narcissistically, if that's a word. I think that the intention of the receiver is where the magic happens, not the guide that's taking them there. It's the person, it's you. The reason you had such an outpouring of that love is because your heart was ready to receive that. And that person just acted as a very human conduit or guide for what you needed and were willing and ready to experience. But there are a lot of really, I've watched so many cult documentaries. It's ridiculous because it's really helped me to see how people get manipulated. And I watched them a lot with my daughter, and we would just be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. And then you start to see it show up in some of these groups. Mm-hmm. And you see how that BITE model, behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions, are manipulated or controlled to keep people thinking a certain way, believing a certain way. So yeah, I just wanted to offer that because it sometimes it's like it happens not because of them, but in spite of them, that you receive such a powerful experience.
Yeah, that could very well be true. And I know that for me, it's just been pretty critical that I kind of ride the edge of the blade, and that I really practice keeping my eyes open and seeing things and being truthful about them. I don't necessarily try to shame anyone, but I need to keep my eyes open. Spirituality is a beautiful thing, and it's really where my heart is and where I feel like most of my work is going to be done as a human being. But there's a lot that gets mixed into the pot. Not only our best intentions and our brightest abilities, but also the things that we're unconscious of. And this is what I see a lot amongst women, this power drive. I think that being empowered is critically important, and it's something that I would advocate for. But sometimes we have this unconscious drive, oftentimes stemming from childhood trauma and patriarchy, where, we want to be the ones in charge, God damn it. We want to be the ones that are being listened to. We want to have that big feeling of like, being worthy, being important. And that's a bitch. And that's going to mess with you. And if you can't look at that shadow, it's going to do all kinds of harm. It's going to wreak all kinds of havoc in your personal life and in the lives of the people that you're trying to help.
The word power is really charged because we've all, just like we've internalized patriarchy, we've internalized false authority figures and false power. So it hasn't been adequately modeled to us. What does a woman power? How does she show up authentically? And, I do provide empowerment programs for women. And one thing I found is that if you try to get someone to define power, it's the wrong definition. So they're ascribing it to hierarchy or being an authority over or power over. And for me, and this is why I love the Magdalene, is that it's power with the people. Jesus, Mary Magdalene is power with. And it means empower is, to me, almost like empathic. It's also, and you have to look at your Enneagram, you have to look at your astrology. I know I'm a huge fan of this now. Like some people, and I would put myself in this because I'm an Enneagram 1 and I'm a numerology 1. And like, I love leadership and I love the idea of gathering people. But I've disattached myself from anything over. So it's like, let me be your guide. What do you think? Which is exactly how Christ approached his power, is going into inquiry with people and speaking in parables and nuance, if you will, but also calling out distortion and throwing over money changers when he needed to, right? So it's that, like, women haven't had modeled to us what it means to be in healthy power, and that's part of that internalized patriarchy.
Exactly. Yes, and so that's another one of these missing kind of threads of guidance like, what does this look like, especially as a woman? And I reach a lot. I reach a lot for these archetypes. Mary Magdalene, I meditate on her. I read texts associated with her. I try to imagine how she may have handled these things. But I guess what I'd like to stress is, even though that's the case, implementing the best ideas that I can come up with, most revelatory, like visions that I have, implementing them is a process of trial and error.
Yeah.
I make so many mistakes. Yeah. And then if I'm being wise, I'll take a step back, I'll examine the mistake, I'll turn it over and upside down and stretch it out like an accordion and try to find in there the lessons so that I don't repeat the mistake. And yeah, I want to stress that. And then I'd like to loop back to a comment that you made about mysticism, how you defined it. And this is another piece that I see coming up a lot in these circles. And it's something that I have questions about, and something that I hope to learn more about in the future. But something that will happen a lot in these circles is there's a real movement towards, self-love and reclaiming the self, embracing the self. And oftentimes people will say things like, everyone's a mystic, or, everyone has this part of themselves, which could very well be true. But I see a lot, basically this deep self-loathing that hasn't been acknowledged or looked at, probably because it's wrapped in a lot of pain and trauma. This deep self-loathing gets itself in the driver's seat. And then it just sort of jets off in the direction of things that it thinks are going to compensate for it, things that it thinks are going to make it feel better. And mysticism is one of those things.
Interesting. Filling the hole of inadequacy, really, just, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Carol, is it her name? Carolyn Miss, I think? Carol
Mice, M-Y-S.
Mice.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. She talks about how, she teaches courses on archetypes and intuition. Mm-hmm. And she talks about how among the people she works with, the archetype that's most clamored after is mysticism. That's the one that people really want to claim. I assume, there could be lots of reasons for that, but if we have these deep-seated complexes around power and self-love that
it's
aren't
really
being
fear.
rectified.
It's just fear of that power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Because in our minds, to be a mystic, to be one who communes with the divine, is to be, very powerful, very full of love, perhaps. I don't know. But I do know that I've also observed this. It's a mantle that people are very quick to put on. And I guess what I'd like to present is that there may be two truths here. One may be true that part of the human condition is that everyone has a spiritual center. Everyone has the ability to commune with the divine. Therefore, everyone could potentially be a mystic.
Sure.
But developed talent also has its own value. And the reality is, in our society, like largely, and also macro and micro, meaning the larger spiritual world and Mormonism, we have a real shortage of elders. We have a real shortage of people who have successfully individuated, really, really matured as human beings, right? Which is what we're talking about in the land of the feminine. This is why we have so much missing guidance. It's because very few people have done it.
I'm so glad you're bringing that up.
So yeah, please go ahead and I can finish on.
No, I'm reminded of, and this is around the time I met you, I was praying, okay, just show me a woman. And in saying this, I do not denigrate belief systems. I do not, this is not in judgment. This was just an honest, with my personality, with the way I'm starting to see things and how I want that individuation, which, as you know, if you know James Fowler's stages of faith, that's the highest degree, is to individuate, and not be with the group thing. So I was looking and I was trying to find mentors in women who were doing that. And so I would ask for that, just like you mentioned earlier, where you were like, where are they? Right. And so remember, I had two women come to my mind immediately, which I recognize these two women were both authors of books. And I knew these women were LDS or Mormon, and I knew that they had written very deep wisdom teaching type of work. One I knew personally, one I did not. So I was like, okay, those are my two women. They're showing up in their own kind of way with their own mantle of authority. They're writing these books. They've individuated. That was my okay. And they were older women. They were in their advancing years. And very quickly, I learned that both of them had left the church within a week. And it was like no accident that I just had found this out. And they're very much under the radar with it. They've made no public acknowledgement of where they're at with their faith. But I found it so interesting that those were the two that I looked up to the most and I guess respected and felt the most kinship with their work and their wisdom teachings and their way of looking more nuanced at how things work. And then I'm like, well, then, okay. And the thought was, Sheree, just be you, be who you want, what you're seeking out there as a role model, like just become that composite person that you really want to be. So I just wanted to insert that because it just came up really strong when you were mentioning that.
Yeah. I remember we talked about this before, and it sounds like that was a really powerful kind of moment of realization for you, and also confirmation and validation that you were on the right track to listen to yourself. My experience and viewpoint has been that within our faith tradition, there really isn't available space for a woman to be in her power. And
at least not fully.
No.
And we don't really have a matriarch if we're talking patriarchy, because the word patriarchy is literally held up in Mormonism as like almost perfect. Like it's like become kind of a negative word in the consciousness, but in Mormonism, that's a really positive word, patriarchy, the patriarchy. But we don't have a matriarchy. And so that would be okay if we had both kind of side by side in terms of divine coupling or shared leadership or shared authority and power. But I love how you brought up that in Mormonism, you're acutely aware in any church setting of who has the authority in the room. That's just always where your head goes. And it's always priesthood. Unless it's a gathering of women and there's like a sustained leader or calling in just the women's group. But even then they're presided over literally by priesthood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a great example of the point that I was kind of making as you offered your, supportive perspective on what this looks like in the culture that we come from. So yeah, in these power structures, the authority that's being conferred upon people, it really doesn't have a lot to do with developed talent or developed skill sets. It's, supposedly something that just moves upon you by the Spirit or the Holy Ghost. And then, people are arranged in various hierarchies according to that outlook, I guess. And the point that I'd like to draw about mysticism is this. Early Christian mystics, the famous ones like Hildegard von Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, whom I know you love. This wasn't just a whim that they had one day. It wasn't just that they realized, oh, I have a predilection for spiritual things. Like, oh, I have an intuitive self. This was a developed talent and a developed skill set And it required years and years and years of sacrifice. Now, I'm not saying that if you want to develop into a mystic that you have to necessarily ascribe yourself to a nunnery or to a celibate life, but that's part of the craft. That was part of their craft. They weren't raising children. They were fully, completely devoted to research, writing, spiritual experimentation, service, right? Contemplation, right? And these works that they produced were produced after decades, oftentimes, of this kind of inquiry.
Beautiful point. That's a beautiful point.
So there's a real, there's real sacrifice associated with it, especially, I think I said this earlier, within the Mormon spiritual framework, we have a lot of rules about a lot of things, and some of them are rules about God specifically. The nature of God, what God can do. That makes me giggle a little bit. What God will do.
So ridiculous.
Yeah. These mystics who produced these enduring works, they opened themselves up to God, and they allowed God to be what God would be, and they recognized themselves in the word inferior. I know that will play on all of this self-loathing, all of these worthiness complexes. I know it will, but I'm going to use it for lack of a better term in this moment. They recognize themselves as an inferior power to that power, right? And they allowed the force of God to move upon them and act upon them. And I'm sure in some ways it was a conversation, but that hasn't been my experience with mysticism, not mostly. Mostly it's a willingness to recognize your place in the universe as a tiny little speck with two legs walking on a rock in the middle of nowhere. And faith in that framework it's a radical proposition. So yeah, that's something I'd also like to draw to your attention. There are lots of different kinds of teachers out there. In fact, there's a proliferation of them on Instagram. And unlike becoming a therapist, there are no prerequisites for opening an Instagram account and making yourself available.
The expert, the resident expert, yeah.
Right. And so if you're leaving a system of belief and you're transitioning into a wilderness, that means that it's pretty much on you to be discerning and to figure this stuff out, which I don't personally think is totally fair. And that's why when I facilitate or speak, I try to lead with information about where I come from and kinds of mistakes I've made. I want that to be available to you so you can make decisions about how you're going to engage. But this is another important factor, and it is that I guess you have to ask yourself, is developed talent important to me? Is it important enough to me that I can quiet my inferiority complex? I can quiet my self-loathing. There's a writer that I really dearly love named Stephen Jenkinson, and he talks about this in terms of elderhood. And he talks about the crisis of elderhood here in North America, and also the problems on the other side, the problems among the young. And I pulled a quote from him that reads, this is it. He says, "You can't talk to an older person as if they were your peer and have their age survive the onslaught of your familiarity." So, wow. What I take from that is this. Yes, we do have a crisis of elderhood in our culture and in our midst.
And honoring the grandmother, part of that elderhood. The crone, the wise woman.
Right. So there are two sides to the coin. The first side is that there's a shortage of these people here. The second side is that were you to find such a person, you may not be prepared to interact with them appropriately. And you may actually shut off the transmission of wisdom because you yourself are so deeply unprepared and so deeply unwise, and you can't recognize the difference between you and them. And from my vantage point, I see a lot of this happening because people are deeply insecure, deeply wounded, and their self-loathing is in the driver's seat, or their, need for power, which generally is an expression of some very, very disempowering set of experiences that happened early on that haven't been corrected for and are now expressing themselves in adult life. But I think these concepts are really important. For me, for myself, I have enlisted teachers who are not entirely mature, and I've accepted that that's okay. And I've still, as you said, received really, just beautiful, beautiful things. And, the more I think about your perspective, Cherie, the more I think that there's a lot of merit to that. I think we can't ever get discouraged by the fact that our culture is in the shape that it's in, because that's the moment at which we stop producing momentum in the right direction. And I do think that the divine can reach us through all kinds of containers and all kinds of experiences. Obviously, if that weren't true, we wouldn't have had the positive experiences that we had in Mormonism. And I know you well enough to know that you've had those as well.
Yeah. A lot of beautiful, awe-inspiring. I think the biggest, I felt this crisis of which you speak, and I was asking to be shown it in the reality of it was we do have a shortage of this not only do we have an underdeveloped theology of what a divine feminine or a heavenly mother is, but there's also this hunger for depth and mystery. And can we go into this territory that's not approved yet because God hasn't revealed it yet? Well, yes, we can, because that's where our soul wants to go. And we shouldn't be shamed for that. We should be celebrated for that. And so for me, it was like doing all these things in quiet or in the closet, if you will, for, over a decade or more, until I finally just had to be me. And I think you can resonate with this too, Amber. Like, it's not about going against morality or your conscience. In fact, it's a fine-tuning of this discernment of which you speak. It's a sharpening of what resonates in me, what out here resonates inside of me and what does not, and giving yourself that autonomy and inner authority to allow yourself to go into that space. I'm kind of I have kind of let go of most of my teachers at this point because I'm trying to let my soul direct, because I've amassed so much information in my 54 years, and especially the last 8 or 10 years, that I'm really just wanting to sit and integrate with what's been shown to me, both from a transpersonal level and also from like teachers and books and transmissions, and just really sit with what's next, what feels aligned right now, rather than putting myself on all this pressure to figure things out. And that includes my manuscript. And I know you're working on a manuscript as well. It's like putting that away for like a year and letting myself integrate before if I'm going to put a message out as a wise woman, let's just say, to the world, with hybrid research in my story, then I want to make sure I'm coming at it with the right heart space, and that I've come to terms with my own sense of power or utterance, that it's healthy and it's aligned. So I would love to see this outgrowth of learning from the wise matriarchs and the wise men and women, and allowing that. This is really a cultural crisis. It's not just happening in religions. This is, except we do hold up the quote unquote elders of Israel as our, but you and I both know that there are many people speaking many amazing, I'm just using Eckhart Tolle and Brene Brown as two examples of people who are really transmitting some powerful, relevant, consciousness expanding, real, and I mean messy too, that wasn't the fodder I was getting in the confines of this old tradition, bless it. And so I want to be able to extrapolate, and I know you do too. And that's where the real crisis for me happened. This crisis of elderhood, that's a really powerful title.
Well, I can close with a dream I recently had, and just a few more thoughts about about all of this. Thank you for your reflections and your thoughts about, what this has been like from your perspective. It's really helpful. So I'll just pause for a second because I know sometimes it's helpful to just have a minute to sort of, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yes, we did. We covered a lot of ground.
So for us and for people listening, you can just take a second to let your mind kind of catch up. Okay. So I had this dream a few months ago. In the dream, I was in a cabin with my parents, and I was in the living room writing, and behind me there was a screen door. And suddenly I heard this loud fluttering noise. And I turned around, and there was a great big owl that had its talons kind of enmeshed into the grate, and it was beating its wings really, really loudly. And I could tell that it was trying to come to me. And my heart kind of leapt, and I ran around the couch, and I opened the screen door to let it in. And as it came in, my mother was alerted to its presence, and she grabbed a newspaper and rolled it up really tight and started swatting at it. But she was quite violent, and she hit it really hard, and it flew up above there's like a vent over the oven, and it flew up over the vent and kind of curled up with its wings folded inward and laid down. And I started to weep. And I was like, Mom, what have you done? And then my father came home, or he came into the room, and I faced the owl, and I held my hands open, and I said, come to me. And the owl rolled over and started fluttering towards me with, obviously in a lot of pain. And it came into my arms, and I laid it down on the floor and unfolded its wings, and it had been wounded severely on its left side, and it was bleeding. And it was so painful, this image. It hurt me so badly that I immediately woke myself up, and I couldn't move forward in the dream and tend to the owl because I was so deeply pained by what I was seeing. Anyway, it's a dream I've been playing with quite a bit.
Lots of symbolism there.
Yeah. And I guess what I'd like to kind of bring forward as a closing thought for this conversation is, when we think about all of this, the divine feminine, patriarchy, the crisis of elderhood, all of this, it's really easy to think about it from a default place of sort of, victimization, remembering that we were once children and we were born into this, and thinking about all that's been lost. But I feel that what this dream was offering me was a secondary perspective. I feel like what it was offering me was the consideration that perhaps the reason that this wisdom that I'm seeking, this feminine wisdom, is not coming to me. It might have more to do with me than it has to do with the exterior world. It might have more to do with my lack of preparation and development than it does with, the shortage of women or the shortage of figures. This missing guidance, I think, can absolutely be traced to my mother and my mother's mother and her mother and everything that's happened. But on some deep subconscious level, I've internalized that, and I'm probably acting it out. And so, there's a certain kind of humility, a capacity for receiving, an ability to differentiate between myself and what this wisdom is. I have to be able to see it for what it is to be able to receive it. And that means on some level, I have to have healed quite a bit of my own, self-loathing and insecurity and power complexes and all of that. You know, and if you're listening and you're someone who wants to develop yourself spiritually, perhaps the archetype of the mystic is something that calls to you. I think it's important to remember that that particular archetype, it rotates around service, real service, and you know, and these principles of something like humility. It's something that I think women who are coming out of patriarchy, you know, things like humility, perfectionism, all different empowerment, these kinds of things. When you're coming out of patriarchy, these they might feel like chains because they were probably presented to you as a woman in a way to, you know, keep you down and keep you from
like stay humble, you know, all of the like sackcloth and ashes type of, yeah.
Forgiveness is another really good one.
Yeah.
Peacemaking. Exactly. So we might go through a period of time where we need to shake that off and kind of create a lot of distance, you know. Mm-hmm. I see a lot of that in like girl boss culture. And as we've talked about, just Instagram in general, people are like, okay, I'm going to claim my power now. And men don't do anything before they're advertising their services. So why do I need to, you know, be whatever? Yeah. But you know, like real wisdom, it's something that is cultivated over large periods of time. And these qualities that may have been used in the past to keep you down, there are versions of them that are relevant to this process. So I hope that this is helpful for other listeners, and that my kind of process of trial and error and some of your, you know, experience with trial and error can maybe make the next few steps for a few people a little easier. But for me, it really does all come back to love. And I guess
all of these things that we're talking about can only be cultivated with the spirit of love, or they will not. We will not become embodied with this wisdom. We will not be able to receive the right way. So as I was listening to you speak about, you know, how we fall short with certain skill sets, or we don't have the right training, or, you know, we haven't, quote unquote, done the time. I think it's important to also bring in like radical self-compassion for what we have walked through. And for me, the practice has been, because I've got so much neural network and patterning that's been laid down on what I lack for so many years. And I understand the philosophy of being humble and peaceful and those things. But as we were talking about spiritual bypassing, like, I think it's completely apropos to stay in shadow realms or states and then the practice is to give yourself compassion in those states where you feel like you're lacking or you're in a shadow, or, and just to underscore what you were saying about, you know, teachers and trainings. I too follow a lot of teachers who are extremely messy and imperfect, and I would be a hypocrite if I judge them, because I also know that I'm still in my own learning and I put myself out there as a teacher, right? But my big red flag is, do I feel love from them? Do I feel genuine, real love? Or do I mostly feel an egoic agenda? And I've gotten really smart at kind of sniffing that out. I've kind of honed that intuitive discernment around that. And I don't judge them as a person, because I know we're all on our own learning path. But at the same time, like, and I can still extrapolate some really valuable things from what they're offering. It just goes to show you, like, everyone is so messy. If somebody's up there saying they're not messy, that's the first indicator that they are. Like, probably one of the more messy teachers, but they're trying to bypass that. I think that's why I listened to a podcast with Brene Brown being interviewed, and that she was asked, like, why do you think you're so, you know, popular? You have one of the most well-watched TED Talks of all time. Like, she's literally knocking out of the park with her persona out in the world. And she's like, it's because she's like, I'm messy. I'm real. And I'm still showing up in that messiness, It's kind of the Oprah phenomenon, same thing, this. So I don't think that we ever arrive at this mystical, like, I'm here now, I'm connected to God. Like, it's always going to be this dance of disconnection, connection, incubating, metamorphosing, initiating, coming back, and then maybe coming back in the full sun, and then coming back into, like, at least that's how I'm accepting that now. Whereas I thought in my old paradigm that I would arrive as a mystic and I would arrive at a certain place. And now I'm just sitting with, it's so interesting to be human, and just observing as a merciful witness how I ebb and flow with that disconnection and connection, and trying to practice that radical self-compassion in the process. So for me, that's the new neural pattern networking that I'm trying to lay down, is how do I bring back compassion when I'm messy, when I'm in a shadow, when my discernment was off, right? All those things.
That's great.
So you have a beautiful offering coming up for people who are local to the Idaho, Utah, Wyoming type area. Why don't you talk about your upcoming retreat? I think it sounds epic.
Thank you. The title of the retreat is Bone Song. Cherie thought that was maybe me speaking French, which would have been so cool, but nope, English, 2 words, bone and song. And we gather in a little cabin in Idaho City for 4 nights. I hosted some retreats in the fall, and these spring retreats are going to be a little bit different. They're especially for women from the Mormon diaspora. I have 1 session available for active members, 1 for people who are post-Mormons, and 1 for women who are in the messy middle. And we're talking about the divine feminine, but we're talking about it as it connects to our maternal lines, our mothers, and their mothers. So we're going to try and practice bringing some of that divine compassion and divine power down into the sinews of our lineage. We're going to talk about how our mothers may have unconsciously perpetuated patriarchy and what we can do to break those chains. So,
and as we liberate ourselves, we automatically liberate our lineages, right? There's that piece of it. I love it. So how did they get a hold of you, Amber, if they were interested in that?
I did start a little Instagram account just for the retreats. The handle is @bone_song_retreats. I'm only posting about the retreats there, but that's the place.
I'll put that in the show notes, and I'll have a link to that. And
Sure.
just thank you. And I love that, you and I can come back to a place where, because we have journeyed so much together with parsing many of these things out, and we were part of each other's, I would say, descent journey quite powerfully. Yeah. It was nice to have you there, because I think compatibly we just were on that same track in terms of what our desire was, which was to stay in integrity and to have true wisdom. And many people couldn't reconcile that was actually my goal when I was disassociating from a patriarchal structure. They just they couldn't reconcile that. But it was nice to have you as a sounding board.
Yeah, I was really grateful to be able to reflect that back to you, and you gave me a lot of gifts in return. So yeah, it's been lovely. It'll be interesting to see where
we're going to be at in another 4 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amber, for your time today.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. And just remember that the views that I share on this podcast are my views and the views of the one I'm interviewing. And sometimes we run away with our passion. That's a good thing, because as we reiterated in this episode, creation is messy. Authentic spirituality is messy. And while we're in the question and while we're in the mess, allow ourselves permission to talk it out and reason it through and feel into our heart space and mind space and body space what this is all about. So that is why I started this podcast. Again, you can find Amber Richardson on Instagram @BoneSongRetreats. If you're interested in attending any of her upcoming retreats, You can find more on the link in the show notes that will be coming up, 3 different sessions in April. You will not be disappointed. She focuses her gatherings around Mary Magdalene, the wild woman archetype, healing the wounds of the patriarchy that have been inflicted on the maternal line. So I leave you with my heartfelt honoring of your path, whatever it might be. All I know is that when someone follows their heart, they cannot go wrong. When you follow your heart, it lights up and gives clarity to your mind. And this is largely a gift of women, that we have this intuitive ability to navigate our own space, our own relationships, our own experience. So I bless you on your way this week and look forward to talking to you again in a couple weeks on Stand, Speak, Shine.